Okay, so this is the 7 or 8-year-old cutting that was made in exactly the same way as that last tree that we just looked at, but this obviously is further along in the process here. Now you'll notice that the trunk has thickened significantly over the course of those 7 or 8 years. This tree should have been up potted into a slightly larger colander or net pot or air pot like we were talking about earlier, but it was not. So it's actually very, very compacted in this pot right here. It hasn't been potted in probably 4 years, maybe 5 years, which is a little bit too long, but there's nothing we can do about it at this point. So we're going to be working with this tree as is, but if we had potted it up in a little bit better pot like that air pot or net pot, the trunk would actually probably be slightly thicker than it is even in this video right here. So just keep that in mind. By the time you get to about that 4th year or so, it's a good idea to go ahead and up pot it into a slightly larger colander so that you get more rapid growth on the tree. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you do that though, you don't want to put it in too large of a pot because then it becomes a problem shrinking the root system back down small enough to put it in the proper size Shohin container. So there is a limit to that. Now the first thing we're going to do with this tree is remove unnecessary branches. So you'll notice here we've got a lot of motion and movement in the trunk down here from all different directions. Very, very interesting. But we've got 3 very straight branches on the tree, all on this side of the plant. We've got this one down low, this one in the center, and this one up here at the top, which is actually the original apex of the tree, or the current apex of the tree. So I'm going to go through and remove those to begin with. We're actually going to turn these into small jin features on the tree. So a jin, or jin, if you want to say it correctly, in Japanese is a deadwood branch. We'll remove the foliage, we'll remove the outer layer of bark, we'll remove the underlayer of phloem, cambium, all the way back down to the hardwood or the xylem underneath. So I'm going to do that on both of these branches, or all 3 of these branches first, and then we'll take a look at the remaining branches on the tree and figure out if there's anything else we want to turn into a jin. So to get this process started, we're going to use the scissors here. I'm going to start at the base on each of these branches and remove a lot of this foliage to the interior here, just so we can see those branches a little bit better here. Now, if this were the right time of year, we could actually save a lot of this foliage that we're getting ready to cut off and use it as a cutting, or take cuttings with it and propagate this tree. But since we're in December right now, any cuttings that we take really probably are very unlikely to survive. So I'm not going to worry about doing that. We're just going to remove these completely here. Now, when you're creating jin or deadwood branches on any conifer, whether that's a juniper like this, or a pine, or a spruce, or anything, you want to make sure to make them long to begin with, and then you can always shorten them back if they don't fit in the final design, or if they look out of place in the final design. You have that option to remove them at that point. So we're going to leave all of these pretty significantly long here. Perhaps we'll even twist them up with a little bit of wire to make them more interesting, and incorporate them into that final Shohin design. All right, so out to about there, I removed the foliage. I'm going to go ahead and cut the rest of this off. It's not very interesting beyond there. It's getting a little bit too long. So we're going to cut that off, set that aside. We're going to do the same thing with these last 2 here. And it looks like, now that I'm actually looking at this, there's another very thick branch on this side of the tree here as well that I don't think is going to be very interesting as a branch to utilize in the design. So I'm going to remove the foliage on it as well, and we'll turn that one into a jin feature too. So when you're deciding which branches should be turned into jins and which ones should be utilized in the design, well, when you're building a Shohin sized tree, what we're really trying to do is cut back to the softest growth that we have available on the tree and build nice, compact, soft branching on the plant that's sustainable over the long run. As I mentioned earlier, these trees are very difficult to create because they grow, they thicken, they elongate over time. So if we're cutting back to heavy branches and trying to manipulate those as part of the design of the Shohin sized tree, you're going to have a very hard time creating it as a Shohin to begin with, and an even more difficult time maintaining it at that size for an extended period of time. So branches that are this thick, these are both, pinky size diameter, maybe pointer finger, index finger size diameter. These are going to be way too big to try to manipulate and use as part of the design, at least in terms of keeping them as live branches on the tree. So it makes much more sense to turn them into jin features on the tree. What we're really looking to do is cut back to very soft growth like this that's manipulable, so we can actually position in the right spot. Now, perhaps some of those branches that are alive that we're leaving as live branches on the tree eventually will thicken over time, and we won't be able to utilize them in the design. At that point, we can either remove them, or we can turn those also into jin features on the tree. All All right, so that's 3 of the 4 branches we're going to remove. Now we're going to remove the apex up here, or the foliage on the apex, and shrink the height of the tree back down. And we got to be strategic about what we're cutting back to in terms of what's going to become the new apex on the tree. Because again, like I said, we want to keep this at or below that 20 centimeter mark, the 8-inch mark. So 8 inches, just as a general rule of thumb, is going to be about this length on your finger. Obviously, the bigger your hand, the longer that space is going to be. But as a general rule of thumb, this gives you a decent setup in terms of understanding what is about 20 centimeters or 8 inches. So I want to make the tree at or below about that mark. So something somewhere in this general area right here, we have this branch that's pretty flexible, this one here that's flexible, and this one coming from the rear that are all flexible that we can potentially utilize as the apex of the tree. So I want to make sure to keep those intact for now, and we're only going to strip off what's beyond those branches there. Okay, so before we strip any of these gins back and remove that bark and the phloem and the cambium back down to the xylem, the hardwood underneath, what I want to do is go through and clean out the rest of the tree so that we can see the structure a bit better. This may dictate if we turn other branches into gins or if we want to change the angle or whatnot. It'll also help allow us to apply the wire a little bit more easily when we get into that stage of this process. So in terms of what I'm going to clean off of this tree, I'm going to remove the undersides of a majority of these branches here. So this foliage is kind of dangling off the bottom. We can either remove it with scissors or we can pull it off by hand. But again, it's not technically pinching because I'm removing the foliage completely all the way back to the hardwood or the semi-hardwood shoot. But I do want to get that out of there so we can see the structure a bit better and apply the wire more easily. I'm also going to remove crotch growth on the branches. So we're trying to create kind of a bifurcating or split branch structure. So it splits, 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 so on and so forth. So in order to do that, we need to remove any crotch growth. So that little fuzz that's growing in between the bifurcations of our branches further back in, we're going to remove that growth as well. And of course, I'm going to remove any tiny, tiny little branches or little pieces of foliage that are emerging directly from the trunk so we can see the trunk line a little bit better. Now, there are always exceptions to removing crotch growth on trees. So for example, if you've got a very long branch and you've got nothing on the interior but only the foliage on the end, so a little tuft of foliage at the end of that branch, you might consider leaving that crotch growth to cut back to at some point in the future development of the tree. But as a general rule of thumb, that crotch growth needs to come off the plant. Okay, so this is what I wanted the tree to look like here before we move on to the next step in the styling process. You can see all of the main branches have been exposed. We've cleaned the undersides of those, cleaned out the crotch growth, but I want you guys to also notice that I've kept a lot of that lateral growth here that's closer to the trunk on our main branches. These are going to be very important in the long run because, again, this is going to elongate over time and we're going to need to have something to cut back to. So these are very, very important. So don't just strip everything that's close to the trunk. Only take off the underside stuff and the stuff that's coming directly out of the crotches of the branches. Now, the next step in the process here is going to be to strip all of the former live tissue here on all of these straight branches, and we'll see what we want to keep in terms of length or if we want to add some motion to those. But we need to get that old live tissue off of there first. So the best way to do this is to take the gin plier here. The name gin plier obviously implies what you're going to be using it for. What we're going to do here is actually crush all of this old live tissue here from the tip of the branch back. It seems to be a little bit easier to peel away if you do this from the end of the branch back towards the interior here. Okay, so this is what we want the tree to look like once we've stripped back all of the tissue on those gins. Now, as you can see, they're very bright, very in your face, very long, very straight. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be adding some wire to some of these, manipulating them into position to add some more motion and interest to them, and perhaps shortening all of them or some of them. So we'll see what happens as we get further into the design. But before we do that, what I want to do next is work on the shari, which is essentially the deadwood on the trunk. Now, junipers are really interesting because they'll produce in nature a vein-like appearance, so a live vein that's running up the trunk, twisting all around, feeding the foliage at the top, and that's contrasted against the deadwood that naturally occurs based on the elements beating the tree back. We can recreate something similar to that effect with field-grown or container-grown material like this. Now, in order to do this, we need to identify the twists, the original twists and turns in the trunk, and then figure out if any of these branches that we've just killed off are attached in any areas where we can actually add a shari that connects into those. Because typically when a branch dies in nature on a juniper, wherever that branch is attached on the trunk, below that it will start to die back. That's where the origination of the shari on the trunk will really begin, is right at the base of those dead branches. So all of these jins that we just created, that'll be really a good spot to start tracing back the lines and the motion in the twists that were originally put in the tree, and then we'll add in some shari. So I'm going to bring the camera a little bit closer. We're going to focus in on the tree, and I'll point out exactly what I mean. Okay, so if you take a look at the trunk here, there's a lot of interest from this side where you're viewing it here. There's a lot of motion and movement, nice taper. There are branches on both the left and right side of the tree, some towards the back as well, which will give us nice depth to the plant. Now, if we flip the tree around to the other side, you've got a similar situation, really nice wide base, really cool movement, and a lot of branching on here. Now, the issue with the branching on this side of the tree is that we have a lot of branches actually coming directly straight out towards you. Those are going to be very difficult to manipulate around and put into position. So I'm actually thinking that we're probably going to make the front of the tree from this side right here. That way we have a lot of depth back here, and it's just going to be an easier build and still look just as cool from this side. Now, again, the issue here is we've got these very large jins here that are coming right directly out at us. So again, we are going to shorten those or manipulate those. But again, before we do that, what I want to do is figure out if we can add some shari in to the trunk here to make it more interesting. So let's start at the very base of the tree here. If you view the base, it may be a little difficult to tell in the video, but the trunk actually comes up from here. This is the original base of the tree. It comes up, twists back down to this branch. It's emanating from the base of that curve. Then it twists back in and around on itself, and that's where you get the secondary twists further up the trunk. So what we can do here is actually trace back from this branch here and add a little bit of a shari into the trunk here. That's going to accentuate the curvature of the base of the tree here when viewed from the front. So in order to do this, what I'm going to use is just a standard box cutter. So a razor blade like this right here. And I'm actually just going to trace out what I think is an interesting line through here. The trunk is entirely alive at this point, so we do have a little bit of leeway in terms of where we add that shari in. But again, I want to start at this particular jin here, and we're going to work our way back from there. Now, if you're not really sure where the shari should go, if you're not really sure what's going to look aesthetically pleasing, you can take a Sharpie or some chalk, for example, and draw that line out, and then cut out on both sides of that line and peel the tissue out in between. But keep in mind, when you're building an initial shari on a tree like this, we want to keep that shari, or the width of that shari, relatively conservative. So the diameter of the trunk here is about 1.5 inches or so. So the shari, I only want to make it about 1/8 of an inch, maybe up to 1/4 of an inch wide. And the reason I want to do that is because if I were to make the shari very, very wide here, say like 1/2 inch, for example, or 3/4 of an inch, yeah, it might look cool, it might look interesting and powerful, but in the long run, it's just going to be a big flat piece of deadwood. Whereas if I make the shari very narrow, so let's say about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch, what we're going to get is a callousing on both sides of that shari line where I make the initial cuts. Wherever that callus heals over, when we go back and open that shari up a little bit further, say in 1 year or 2 years from now, wherever that initial callus was, there's going to be a striation there underneath that. So it's going to give us a very natural look if we do it year after year after year. So if we start small, it'll callus, we'll open it up wider, it'll callus again, we'll open it up a little wider, it'll callus again, and each time you get that really cool striated look to the tree. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to add that into this area, and I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to flip it around for you here in just a second. I'm not sure if you can see this here, but as I push the knife into the trunk here, going deep enough to get all the way down to the hardwood underneath, that's the xylem underneath the cambium. Now we want to make sure that we make the lines on both sides of the shari here very sharp so that next year it really calluses over and we can start building that striated look here. So as I do this, I'm going to now pop out the tissue on the interior here between both of those cuts that I made on either side. You can see it starts to peel away here. Be extra careful. We don't want this to go outside of the bounds of those cuts that I just made. Now, if you're having trouble getting that knife in there to pop it out, you can use a specialty tool like this. This is just a little dental pick. We can pop that tissue out in between. You can also use specialty tools like this right here. It's a little scraping tool. to get some of that excess tissue out of the way. Now, as you're doing this, you'll notice that this is all very white tissue right here. That's still a layer of the cambium on here that I'm trying to get off of there, and actually some phloem on there as well. I want to get all of that white fuzz off of there down to the sort of yellowy color hardwood or xylem underneath. All right, so that gives us our initial shari right at the base of the tree. Now you notice I wasn't able to get all of that fuzz, that white tissue off of there. That will fall off over time, but as long as the edges on both sides of the shari are nice and sharp, that will start to callus almost immediately, which is what we want. So now that we've got that out of the way, we can start to work our way up the trunk. And what I'm gonna do is, again, I'm gonna go up to the upper areas of the trunk here where we've already got jin features that we just created, and we're gonna work back from there. So the next jin up on the trunk here is this guy right in the center here. So if you notice here, we've got the initial bend coming up, down and around. It comes around the backside and actually wraps up underneath and continues around and connects up to this jin right here. So what I'm going to do is start at the top here with this jin and work my way back down, following those lines, and essentially attach it to this jin down here at the base. It's going to be pretty cool, I think. All right, so that takes care of this shari right through here. I'm gonna flip it back around to the front here. We're gonna continue this line up around the front here. Now, in this area, it actually doesn't twist anymore. It just moves back and forth essentially until we get up to the top of the tree. So I'm gonna take this shari line along the front side, up and around, and then we'll cap it out somewhere in this area, basically up and around where this last little jin is at the top of the tree. All right, so you can see now that I've added the shari all the way up the trunk that there's a lot more interest now on this side of the tree. Now I'm gonna flip the tree around so you can see it from the other side here. The only shari that's visible from this side is this piece right through here. I didn't want to add too much to both sides of the tree. In other words, I didn't want to spiral the shari all the way up to the top of the tree, just because that can be detrimental to the health of the tree. So in the future, we'll be adding a little more shari up and around on the back side towards the top here, so we can really start to get that interesting live vein versus deadwood effect. But for the time being, that is as extreme as I want to go. Now, again, we're going to have to address these jins. So what I want to do here is actually add some wire to these guys. But I think there's one in particular that I know for sure is just going to be too long, even if we do wire it and move it into place. And that's this guy right in the middle here. This thing is just in a ridiculous spot, and I think it's going to be very distracting to have that coming out of the front of the tree. So I'm going to go ahead and shorten this one way down, somewhere down in here. We may leave it a little bit longer to start with and add slight motion to it, and maybe shorten it back further beyond that once we set the branches. But in order to do this, what I'm going to do is just grab this branch right about here. I use the jin pliers here, and we're just going to crack this thing and pop it off. Use some scissors here to shorten this back, break up this tissue a little bit, like so. And then we can peel that back. Now, the ends of all of these jins here, I want to make sure that those look pretty natural. So I'm going to feather this tissue back and try to create either a tapered end or a gnarly, kind of broken up end, so it gives it a much more natural appearance. The cool thing here too is I can actually pull these fibers further down into the shari that we've already created. That also adds a bit of naturalness to each of those elements too. I'm going to be extra careful at the base here not to go too far, because I don't want to rip it and tear into the live tissue either. So we'll cut this back just to stop it right there. All right, so that takes care of that issue coming directly out at us. Now let's address this guy on the bottom here. I think we could actually probably take this jin right here and bend it down in this direction significantly so it flows with the overall directionality of the tree. So I'm going to leave that guy alone for the time being. Now the jin up here at the top, that's another one that I think we can add some interesting motion and movement to. So I'm going to leave it slightly long for the time being. But again, I'm going to break back the ends just to give us a little bit more of a natural appearance here, and I want more variation in the lengths of both of these. We don't want them to be the same length. It just gives it kind of a devil horn kind of look, which is not an ideal situation here. It'll draw your eye too much to that area of the tree, which is not really necessarily that interesting, at least not relative to the trunk and the movement lower in the tree. Okay, that looks pretty good right there. All right, so the next step here is going to be to apply wire to the remaining branches. Now again, as I mentioned earlier in the tutorial, I've kept essentially only soft branching on the tree with the exception of the apex up here. I want to create kind of a continual line all the way to the top that caps out somewhere around here. So this is actually going to be whipped around and manipulated in a way where what is the top of the tree, this branch right here, will actually become a lateral branch off to the side, and all of this smaller growth on the interior in the long run will become the new apex on the tree. So I'll show you what that looks like once we get up into that area. But for starters, we're going to start at the bottom of the tree and work our way up. So I'm going to get a wire on this gin to begin with right here, so that we can manipulate it down into place. What we're going to do here is similar to what we did on the small whip at the beginning of this tutorial. We're actually going to take a thick wire, so in this case a size 10 wire here, and I'm going to stick it into the soil so that I can get a nice anchor there, and we're going to take this down out onto that gin. So in the case of this gin right here, since this is the front of the tree, I want to whip this down and around off to the side here. So the wire in this case is going to have to go clockwise to make that happen. So I'm going to stick it into the soil here, right at the base. We're going to take this up and around and we're going to go clockwise with this. All right, I'm going to double up with this extra wire that I've got, just to give us some better holding power here. Okay, and now we can manipulate this down and off to the side here. Now as I'm bending this, I'm actually twisting the branch as I go so it doesn't snap in half. This works well for deadwood and for live branches. If you need to bend a heavy branch, if you twist it, it ends up distributing the energy down the length of that branch rather than creating just a compression side and a tensile or stretch side on the outside, which is likely to snap at some point. If you twist it as you go, that energy gets distributed and you can bend a branch much further that way. All right, so that gives us a cool effect here. Now, if you're creating deadwood on a tree like this, where it's a live branch, you remove the tissue and then you put wire on it, go ahead and bend it instantly or immediately after you do that part of the process. That way it will actually bend for you, because as soon as this dries out within a couple of weeks, it's going to be nearly impossible to do this kind of bend to it. Now, it did tear in a couple of places, but that's not that big a deal. As it dries out, it will lock itself into place, and eventually we can take this wire off and that will essentially stay where it is. Now, this gin being at the base of the tree here, it's very likely that this is going to rot off over time anyway, just because it's being watered right down here at the base. So this may not be a long-term feature, and really in the end when we place the branches, it might look out of place and weird anyway, so we might cut it off. Like I said before, we always have that option. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's move up into the middle of the tree right here. We're going to be wiring these branches. So I'm going to use a size 12 for these guys. That should be plenty to hold these into place. And since this is the front of the tree right here, I want to apply the wire from the rear of the plant so it doesn't look messy from the front. So we're going to come across the backside and wire these two guys out right here. All right, now that I've got that on, we've got this branch to the rear that still needs wire, and the end of this branch, the original wire didn't go far enough out, which is actually done on purpose here, so that I can then anchor this out to the end. This will serve as that anchor for this branch and the tip of this one. So in this case, we're going to be using the same size wire to hold this in place. It might be a little thick for this, but I'd rather have it be one size too big to hold it into place than be too small and have it flop. All right, so let's work our way up into the middle portion of the tree here. We've got this branch right here and this one are both about the same diameter, so we should be able to attach those two together. Now, this branch right here is actually emanating from the back side of the tree, coming up and over the top. Not really that big a deal, particularly when you're building Shohin trees. We're going to be able to manipulate this back down and around to really give us some depth towards the rear. But knowing that, I want to make sure that this wire on this branch goes on clockwise as well, because it's going to be pulled down in this direction. I want that wire to tighten as we go, and we're going to be using that same size 12 on this to be able to hold the branch into place. All right, and then the last couple of branches here we're going to be wiring together are these two, so our last lateral branch at the top and what will be our apex. And then we're going to throw a little bit of wire on the two gins here to be able to manipulate those, and then we'll place the branches. Okay, so as you can see, all of the branches and the gins have been wired at this point. So now what I'm going to do is just set them into place. Now, the first directional branch over here on the left side of the tree already has an unbelievably cool amount of movement to it. So I'm not really going to manipulate that one too much. It's just going to drop down essentially as kind of like a semi-cascade type tree. So what I'm going to do here with the last section of the branch is just try to mimic the movement in the first part of the branch so it's continuous throughout. Then the remaining branches on the tree here, we're going to try to mimic this first branch. So I want a consistent amount of movement for the most part in all of those branches. So we're going to add quite a bit of movement to a lot of these here. As I'm doing this here, if anything starts to droop off the bottom, I will remove that foliage just like we did at the beginning of this process when cleaning the undersides of the branches. As I start to twist and drop these down, there will be things that dip a little bit too far out of the desired profile, so I'm removing those by hand once again. All right, so that gets our first branch into place here. It's kind of intertwined and plays with the deadwood that we've created down here. They mimic one another. This creates kind of a picture frame around that, which I think is pretty cool. So it's looking like we're probably going to keep this for the time being. So the next thing is going to be to drop this back branch down, which again already has some pretty interesting movement to it. We're just going to drop this down towards the rear here to give us some depth. Now I want to be able to see this essentially from both sides when you view it from the front. So I want a little bit peeking around the right side of the tree here and a little bit peeking around the left side of the tree on the other side. All right, now the counterbalance branch here on the right side of the tree, this needs to be pushed in significantly. I don't want it to be equidistant on both sides. In other words, I don't want the branch on this side to be as long as the branch on this side. Because the tree is moving to the left, everything on the opposite side of that, so everything on the left side of the tree, needs to be a little bit tighter, closer, more compact towards the trunk so your eye really moves in the intended direction that I want your eye to move. So we're going to shorten this by adding motion side to side and up and down. So specifically right out of the trunk here, if we take it towards the rear first and then back around towards the front, that gives you your first little bit of shortening there. And then we'll add some upward and downward motion here to take care of the rest. All right, now that we've done that, some of this growth that's coming up out of the top of this branch is sticking up a little too far. It's in a weird spot now, so we can go ahead and remove that. Okay, now I'm gonna fill this next layer in with this little guy right here, and then we're gonna come over to the other side, add a little more motion here. Now, this branch is gonna be way too long here outside of the profile. I can already tell that. So once I place it, we're gonna cut this one back significantly here so it really fits in the right spot. Okay, so let's take this guy again towards the back first. Then up and down, side to side. All right, that looks pretty good, but again, this is a little bit too long, so we're going to shorten this back to here for now. And we may take it back even further once we do the final touch-ups on the tree. Okay, so now we're at the apex of the tree here. We've got this branch that we're going to dip down over here. That's pretty obvious. This that I mentioned earlier, this is going to be the apex. So essentially this stuff right here will actually become the apex, but this out at the end here will end up being a lateral branch on this side of the tree. I'm going to loop-de-loop it around. And then this branch, we need some more depth over here. So this is actually going to be whipped around. Like I said before, this is going to be wired clockwise, which it was. We're going to whip this around to the back to give us some depth on this side right here. So I'm actually going to set that one first just to get it out of the way. Okay, now we'll set this one and then we'll whip the apex around here. All right, and now for the apex. All right, so that is the final design for this initial styling of this Shohin Shimpaku juniper. So I'm gonna put this up against the white backdrop so you guys can see exactly what it looks like with all of the branches in the right spot and the jin and shari placed now. And we'll come back and discuss this right at the very end. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Bonsai-U and that you understand a bit more about the process of building Shohin Shimpaku juniper bonsai. We'll be doing a follow-up episode on this tree as it gets repotted in an actual bonsai container and as it develops over the next few years. So be on the lookout for that. I want to thank you guys so much for your support. If you really like what we do here, make sure that you like and subscribe down below and click that little bell button next to the subscribe button. That'll make sure that you get notifications when we put up a new Bonsai-U video. And if you really, really want to support us, you can head over to my website. I will put a link in the description down below where you can donate to Bonsai-U going forward to help support this platform going into the future. Until the next video though, take care and thank you guys so much for checking out this episode.